Margaret Ashworth's hand froze over the open drawer, her fingers still touching the small oval frame she had just pulled free from beneath a stack of old ledgers. The face looking back at her from the tiny painted portrait was her own. Same gray eyes, same small scar above the left eyebrow, same stubborn set of the mouth. She had never sat for a portrait in her life, yet here she was, painted in a gown she did not own, in a room she had never entered before today. The door opened behind her before she could close the drawer. "You were told not to touch anything in that desk." The Duke of Ravenswood stood in the doorway, tall and unreadable, his coat still dusted from the ride he had taken that morning. Margaret pushed the drawer shut with more force than she meant to, and the portrait slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor between them. Julian Hartford's eyes dropped to the small painted face lying on the boards. For one instant, something crossed his expression that Margaret could not name. Not surprise, recognition. "Where did you find that?" he said quietly. "In the drawer, Your Grace. I was not searching for it. I was arranging the ledgers as you instructed, and it was beneath them." He crossed the room in 3 strides and bent to pick it up. He did not look at her when he spoke again. "This does not concern your work here. You will forget you saw it. Forgive me, Your Grace, but that is my face." The words left her before she could stop them. She watched him go still, the portrait held loosely in his hand, his jaw tightening as though she had struck him. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the only sound in the study was the crackle of the fire and the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. "You are mistaken," he said at last. "It is a family likeness, nothing more." Margaret knew a lie when she heard one. She had grown up watching her father, a steward on a much smaller estate, manage difficult men for a living, and she had learned early how to read a face that did not want to be read. The Duke's face, in that moment, was full of things he was not saying. She had come to Ravenswood Hall only that morning, hired through a letter of recommendation from a solicitor in London who handled the estate's affairs. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her with debts she could not pay, and a small cottage she could not keep. When the offer came to organize the private archive of a duke who had let his family's papers fall into disorder for years, she had not asked many questions. She needed the wages, she needed a roof that was not about to be sold out from under her. Now, standing in a grand study with a stranger who owned half the county, she wondered if she had walked into something far stranger than a housekeeping post. "I will return to the ledgers, Your Grace," she said carefully, "if that is still your wish." He studied her for a long moment, the portrait still in his closed hand. "It is my wish that you finish what you were hired to do, and nothing else. You are not to open that drawer again." "Yes, Your Grace." He left without another word, and Margaret stood alone in the study for a long time before she trusted her hands enough to pick up her pen. The rest of the day passed in strange, careful silence. She catalogued letters and account books, sorted deeds and correspondence into neat piles, and tried not to think about the small painted face that matched her own so exactly it could have been drawn from a mirror. She told herself it was coincidence. Families sometimes produced faces that echoed across generations, cousins who resembled cousins, strangers who resembled strangers by pure chance. But the scar above the eyebrow was not chance. She had gotten that scar at 7 years old, falling from an apple tree behind her father's cottage. No painter could have known to put it there unless they had seen her, truly seen her, and she had never in her life sat for anyone with a brush. By late afternoon, an older woman entered the study carrying a tray of tea, and stopped so abruptly in the doorway that the cups rattled against their saucers. "Merciful heavens," the woman breathed, staring at Margaret as though she had seen a ghost rise up from the carpet. "I am sorry, ma'am. Have I startled you?" The woman did not answer at once. She set the tray down with shaking hands, her eyes still fixed on Margaret's face, moving over it the way one studies a familiar road after years away, checking each turn against memory. "What is your name, girl?" "Margaret Ashworth." "Ashworth." The woman repeated it softly, as though testing whether the name fit the face. "And your mother? What was her name before she married?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I never knew her, ma'am. She died when I was an infant. My father raised me alone. He never spoke of her, not once in all my years with him." Something shifted in the older woman's expression, a flicker of sorrow quickly hidden. "Forgive me. I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper here. You simply have the look of someone I once knew, long ago." "It gave me a turn, that is all." She straightened, smoothing her apron, her composure returning like a curtain drawn shut. "Drink your tea before it goes cold. The Duke does not like idle hands in this house, but he does not begrudge a cup of tea either." She left quickly, more quickly than the errand required, and Margaret sat alone with her tea growing cold in front of her, turning the strange encounter over in her mind. Two people in one day had looked at her as though she were someone else entirely. She thought of the portrait again, the gown she did not own, the eyes that were unmistakably her own eyes. She tried to distract herself by returning to her work, sorting a bundle of old correspondence tied with faded ribbon, but her mind kept drifting back to the locked drawer and the strange weight in Mrs. Whitfield's voice. She had spent her whole life being told she resembled no one in particular, that she was simply Margaret, plain and practical, the daughter of a steward who kept his own counsel and his own past sealed away like a chest with no key. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, two strangers had looked at her and seen someone else entirely, someone with a history Margaret herself had never been told. By the time the last of the daylight faded from the tall windows, she had catalogued 3 more boxes of estate papers, forcing her hands to stay steady even as her thoughts wandered. A young footman named Edwin brought in fresh candles as the room darkened, and paused just as Mrs. Whitfield had, his gaze lingering a moment too long on her face before he caught himself and looked away. "Forgive me, miss," he said quickly, setting down the candles with unnecessary care. "It is only that you remind me of a painting my mother once described to me, from when she worked here as a girl. She always said there used to be a governess in this house, years back, who vanished one autumn without a word to anyone. My mother never forgot her face." Margaret's pulse quickened. A governess? What was her name? But Edwin only shook his head, already retreating toward the door as though he regretted speaking at all. "I could not say, miss. My mother rarely spoke of it. It was not a happy memory for this house, from what I understood." He bowed quickly, and left her alone with the candles burning low, and a new name pressing itself into her thoughts. A governess who had vanished, a face that had not been forgotten in 30 years. That evening, she was given a small room at the end of the servants' corridor, plain and clean, with a narrow bed, and a window that looked out over the dark shape of the gardens. She should have been thinking about her wages, about the debts waiting for her back home, about the simple relief of having found respectable work at all. Instead, she lay awake long after the candle had burned low, staring at the ceiling, hearing Mrs. Whitfield's voice again and again in her mind. "You have the look of someone I once knew." Near midnight, unable to sleep, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, telling herself she only wanted air. The corridor was dark and silent, the household long since retired, but a thin line of candlelight showed beneath the door of the study where she had spent her day. She should have returned to her room. She told herself that even as her feet carried her closer. Through the gap in the door, she saw the Duke seated at his desk, the small oval portrait propped against a stack of books before him, his head bowed over it as though it held answers he had been searching for his entire life. He looked in that unguarded moment less like a duke and more like a man carrying a weight he had never set down. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. He looked up sharply, and their eyes met through the narrow gap in the door before she could step back into the shadows. "Miss Ashworth." His voice was low, but it carried the full length of the silent corridor. "Come in." She hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. He did not look angry, as she had expected. He looked tired, and older than his years, and for the first time since her arrival, he looked at her not as a servant hired to sort his papers, but as though he were finally deciding whether to tell her the truth. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "It seems fate has decided you deserve some answers, whether I am prepared to give them or not." Margaret sat slowly, her heart beating fast, her eyes drawn once more to the small painted face lying between them on the desk, the face that was hers and yet could not be hers, waiting to hear what secret had been locked away in that drawer for longer than she had been alive. The Duke did not speak right away. He turned the portrait over in his hands, studying it as though he were seeing it for the first time himself, though Margaret suspected he had looked at it 1,000 times before tonight. The candle between them burned steadily, throwing long shadows across the papers and ledgers she had spent the day arranging, and for a moment the grand study felt smaller than it had all afternoon, pressed close by the silence and the question hanging unspoken in the air. "Do you believe in accidents, Miss Ashworth?" he asked finally, "or do you believe some things are simply waiting to be found?" Margaret held his gaze, though her hands were trembling in her lap. "I believe, Your Grace, that I did not walk into your study by accident, and I do not think that portrait has been waiting in that drawer by accident either. I think you know exactly why my face is painted onto it, and I think it is time you told me." He set the portrait down between them, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ravenswood Hall, he looked at her without any trace of the coldness he had worn since morning. Whatever answer he was about to give her, Margaret understood that nothing about her life, or his, would would be quite the same once it was spoken aloud. Her name was Eleanor. The Duke said it quietly, as though the word itself carried weight he had been carrying alone for years. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, the candlelight flickering between them, waiting for him to say more. She was a governess in this house, before I was born. My father hired her to teach the younger children of the household staff, and later, when my grandmother grew too ill to manage her own correspondence, Eleanor became something closer to a companion for this family. She disappeared one autumn, without warning, without a letter, without a trace. No one ever spoke her name in this house again. Until you arrived this morning wearing her face. Margaret's throat felt tight. You are certain the portrait is of her, and not of me somehow, painted without my knowledge? The portrait is dated, 31 years old. You were not yet born when it was painted. The silence stretched long enough that the fire popped in the grate, startling them both. Margaret thought of her father, of the guarded way he had always spoken of her mother, if he spoke of her at all, and the cold dread building in her chest told her this was no longer a matter of resemblance or coincidence. Why do you keep her portrait locked away, if no one is permitted to speak of her? The Duke's jaw tightened. Because my father asked it of me before he died. He said if anyone came asking after Eleanor, I was to say nothing, and to protect this family's name at any cost. I have obeyed him for years, out of duty rather than understanding. But I did not expect the woman who resembles her exactly to walk into my study and open the very drawer I have never dared to open in front of another living soul. Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay awake turning the name Eleanor over and over in her mind, searching her memory for anything her father might have said that could connect to it, and finding nothing but silence where answers should have been. Her father had been a careful man, a private man, and she had always assumed his silence about her mother came from grief. Now she wondered if it came from something else entirely. The following morning she returned to the study determined to work, but her curiosity had become impossible to set aside. While cataloging a shelf of old household ledgers, she found records of wages paid to staff decades earlier, and among the names listed for the year Eleanor disappeared, she found a small notation beside the governess's entry that made her breath catch. Dismissed, it read, in a hand that was not the same as the rest of the ledger, as though someone had gone back later and altered the record. Dismissed did not match what the Duke had told her. He had said Eleanor disappeared without warning. A dismissal implied a decision, a choice made by someone in this household, not a woman vanishing into the night on her own. She did not mention the discovery to the Duke immediately. Instead, she found herself watching the household with new eyes, noticing things she might otherwise have overlooked. Mrs. Whitfield avoided the west wing of the house entirely, taking longer routes through the servants' passages rather than crossing the old nursery corridor. The portraits lining the main staircase, generations of Hartford ancestors staring down with painted eyes, seemed to stop abruptly at a gap on the wall where a frame had clearly once hung, and had since been removed, leaving only a faint rectangle of unfaded wallpaper behind it. Margaret asked Edwin, the young footman who had spoken to her the previous evening, whether he knew anything more about the missing portrait, but he grew visibly nervous at the question and excused himself quickly, claiming duties elsewhere. It seemed the entire household had been trained, over decades, to treat Eleanor's name as something forbidden, a wound no one was permitted to touch. That afternoon, the Duke found her in the East Gallery, standing before the gap in the row of portraits. "You have been asking questions," he said, not unkindly, though there was tension in his voice. "I found a ledger entry. It says Eleanor was dismissed, not that she disappeared on her own. Those are very different things, Your Grace." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving to the empty space on the wall where the missing portrait had once hung. "My grandmother ordered her portrait removed after she left. I do not know the full truth of what happened between them, only fragments passed down through servants who were sworn to silence. I was a child when it happened. I only know that my father carried guilt about it for the rest of his life, though he never explained why. Guilt over a woman being dismissed unfairly? Or guilt over something else?" The Duke's expression darkened, though not with anger directed at her. "That is precisely what I intend to find out, Miss Ashworth, and it seems I no longer have the luxury of doing so alone." The Duke sent word the next morning to the family solicitor in London, a cautious man named Mr. Pratt who had handled the estate's private affairs for over 20 years. When Mr. Pratt arrived 2 days later, he seemed reluctant to discuss anything concerning Eleanor at all, insisting the matter had been settled long before he took charge of the family's papers. Only when the Duke pressed him directly, reminding him whose authority he answered to, did the solicitor admit that a small trust had once existed, established quietly by the old Duke, intended for the maintenance of a child. The trust had been closed decades ago, its final payment recorded the same year Margaret's father had, according to parish records Margaret later found, arrived in the county with an infant daughter and no wife to explain her presence. Margaret sat with that discovery for a long while, staring at the faded ink on the page until the letters blurred together. Her father had not simply raised her alone out of grief, as she had always believed. He had arrived already carrying her, already keeping a secret so carefully guarded that he had never once let it slip in all the years she had known him. She wondered now whether he had been paid to disappear with her, the same way Eleanor had once been paid to disappear alone. Over the following days, Margaret and the Duke formed an uneasy partnership, searching the estate's oldest records together in stolen hours between her official duties. They found household accounts showing payments made to a cottage some distance from the estate, continuing for several years after Eleanor's departure, payments that stopped abruptly the same year the current Duke's father had married. They found a doctor's bill from a physician in a nearby village, dated only months after Eleanor vanished, listing a payment for the safe delivery of a child, though no name was recorded for either mother or infant. Margaret felt the pieces shifting into a shape she was not yet ready to name aloud, though she suspected the Duke was arriving at the same conclusion, his silence growing heavier with each new discovery. Margaret began to notice, too, how differently the household treated her once whispers of her questions spread below stairs. A scullery maid who had been friendly on her first day now avoided her eyes entirely. The cook, an older woman with a broad Yorkshire accent, pressed an extra slice of bread into her hand one morning and murmured, quick and low, that some doors in an old house were better left shut, before turning back to her ovens without another word. Margaret understood the warning for what it was, yet found she could not heed it. The truth had already taken root in her, and there was no unlearning what she now suspected about her own beginnings. She spent an evening in the estate's small chapel, searching the parish register kept there for the family's private records of birth and burial, and found a line that had clearly been added later, in ink slightly darker than the entries surrounding it. An infant, unnamed, born the same autumn Eleanor vanished, with no mother listed and no father acknowledged. Beside it, in the same later hand, someone had written a single word, living, not deceased, as the household story claimed, but living, crossed through faintly as though someone had tried, and failed, to fully erase the truth. Mrs. Whitfield, cornered one evening in the linen room, finally broke her careful composure when Margaret pressed her gently about the doctor's bill. The older woman's hands shook as she folded a stack of linens that did not need folding, her eyes refusing to meet Margaret's. "I was only a young maid then," Mrs. Whitfield admitted quietly. "I saw things I was told to forget. Eleanor was not simply dismissed for some ordinary fault, whatever the ledger says now. There was a scandal in this house that year, one the old Duke buried as deep as he could bury it. I loved that woman like an older sister, and I watched her carried away in a carriage in the middle of the night, weeping, with nothing but a single trunk to her name. I never learned what became of her after that. I have wondered every single day since whether she survived at all." Margaret reached for the older woman's trembling hands, steadying them the way she might have steadied her own father in his final illness. "You need not carry this alone any longer, Mrs. Whitfield. Whatever happened here, it was not your doing, and it was certainly not the doing of a frightened young maid told to keep her silence." Mrs. Whitfield pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, composing herself with visible effort before continuing. "I have kept this house for 30 years, Miss Ashworth, and in all that time I told myself the silence was a kindness, that some griefs are better left buried than dug up again. But watching you these past days, watching the old Duke's own guilt written so plainly on his son's face whenever your name is spoken, I begin to think the silence was never a kindness at all. It was only a way of protecting the family's name at the expense of a woman who deserved far better from all of us." "And the child?" Margaret asked carefully. "Do you know what became of the child?" Mrs. Whitfield's eyes finally lifted to meet hers, full of a grief 30 years old and never once spoken aloud. "I always believed the child did not survive infancy." That is the story we were all given, and none of us dared question the old Duke about it. But looking at you now, Miss Ashworth, standing in this room with Eleanor's own eyes staring back at me, I find myself wondering if we were told a lie. The words settled over Margaret like a weight she had not been prepared to carry. She thought of her father again, his silence about her mother, the way he had raised her alone in a small cottage far from any grand estate, never once explaining where she had truly come from. If Mrs. Whitfield's suspicion held any truth at all, then Margaret was not simply a woman who resembled a portrait by strange coincidence. She might be standing in the very house where her own story had begun, 30 years before she ever learned to ask questions about it. That night she confronted the Duke in the study once more, laying out everything Mrs. Whitfield had told her. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until she finished, and then he rose from his desk and crossed to the window, staring out into the darkened gardens for a long moment before he spoke. "If what you suspect is true, Miss Ashworth, then everything I understood about my own family is built on a lie my father chose to protect, rather than a truth he chose to face. And if it is true, it changes far more than either of us may be prepared for." "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, and in the candlelight his expression held something Margaret had not seen from him before, a mixture of fear and something gentler underneath it. "I mean that if Eleanor's child survived, and if that child is somehow connected to you, then you may have more claim to this family's history than either of us yet understands. And I find, strangely, that the thought does not frighten me nearly as much as it should." Margaret held his gaze across the quiet study, aware of how close their careful investigation had drawn them together in only a matter of days, aware, too, that the answers waiting to be uncovered might change everything about the life she thought she was building for herself at Ravenswood Hall. "Then we had better find the truth quickly, Your Grace," she said softly, "before someone else decides to bury it again." He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety allowed, and neither of them moved to look away. Mr. Pratt, before departing for London the following day, drew Margaret aside in the corridor and spoke to her in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder as though he feared being overheard. He told her that the old Duke, on his deathbed, had once muttered a name in his fever that no one in the room had understood at the time. Margaret. He had assumed it a family name lost to memory, nothing more, until now. Margaret felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her at the thought that her own name might have been chosen, or perhaps simply remembered, by a dying man who had once wronged the woman she was beginning to believe was her mother. She carried that new fragment of truth with her for the rest of the day, turning it over alongside everything else she had learned, and when evening came she found she could not wait any longer to share it with the one person in the house who seemed to want the truth as badly as she did. Julian listened to the story of the dying man's whisper without a word, his face pale in the candlelight, and when Margaret finished speaking he sat down heavily in his chair, as though the weight of it had finally caught up with him. "My father named his own guilt without ever confessing to it," he said quietly. "He let it slip only when death had loosened whatever control he still held over himself. All these years I believed him a careful man, a private man, much like your own father, it seems. Now I wonder how much of that carefulness was simply a very long apology he never had the courage to finish." "We still do not know for certain that I am the child from the register," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "A name, a resemblance, a series of coincidences. It is not proof." "No," Julian agreed, "but it is enough for me to write to every physician, every solicitor, and every parish clerk who might still hold a record from that autumn. If proof exists anywhere, we will find it." He was true to his word. Over the following week, letters went out from Ravenswood Hall to villages Margaret had never heard of, to retired clergymen and elderly midwives whose names Mr. Pratt had unearthed from decades-old correspondence. Margaret continued her work in the study by day, cataloging papers with hands that had grown steadier despite the storm building around her, and by evening she and Julian pored over every reply that arrived, searching for the one thread that might finally tie the fragments together into something whole. It was Mrs. Whitfield who provided the next piece, arriving in the study one morning with an old wooden box she said had belonged to her own mother, who had also served in the household during Eleanor's time. Inside, wrapped carefully in a square of yellowed linen, lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, addressed in a delicate hand to a friend who had long since passed away, and whose belongings had eventually made their way back into Mrs. Whitfield's family by chance. "I found these years ago, after my mother died," Mrs. Whitfield admitted. "I never had the courage to read them properly, nor the courage to destroy them. I think, somehow, I always knew this day might come." Margaret's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. The letters were written by Eleanor herself, dated across the final months before her disappearance, addressed to a childhood friend in a neighboring county. The early letters were warm and ordinary, full of small observations about the children she taught and the quiet pleasures of country life. But the later letters grew increasingly urgent, hinting at a secret marriage she dared not name openly, at a husband whose position in the world made their union impossible to acknowledge, and at a fear that grew sharper with each passing page. "I am to be sent away before my condition becomes impossible to hide," Eleanor had written in one of the final letters. "He swears he will provide for us, that this is only a temporary arrangement until his father's health improves, and he may finally claim me as his wife before the world. I want to believe him. I fear I no longer can. Margaret looked up from the page to find Julian watching her, his expression carved from stone. His father's health, she repeated softly. The old Duke was already ill by then. Whoever Eleanor married, he was waiting for his own inheritance before he dared acknowledge her. There is only one man in this family who would have been waiting on an inheritance that year, Julian said, his voice low and unsteady. My uncle, my father's younger brother who died unmarried, or so the family always claimed, less than a year after Eleanor disappeared. I never knew him. He died before I was born. The final letter in the bundle, dated only weeks before Eleanor's name vanished from the household records entirely, was shorter than the rest, the handwriting hurried and uneven, as though written in haste or fear. If anything should happen to me, Eleanor had written, I trust you to see that my daughter knows the truth one day, whatever it costs this family to admit it. She is innocent of every choice that brought her into this world, and she deserves better than the silence I fear will be forced upon her. A daughter. Margaret read the word 3 times before it fully settled into her understanding. Not simply a child, as the parish register had suggested, but a daughter, spoken of with a mother's certainty and a mother's fear. She knew she might not survive whatever was planned for her, Margaret said, her voice breaking despite her effort to hold it steady. She wrote this letter believing she might never see her own child grow up. Julian rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her without any regard for the impropriety of the gesture, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Margaret, if this is true, if you are truly Eleanor's daughter and my uncle's child, then you are not a servant hired to sort through my family's papers. You are family, my own cousin, by blood, however distant the world has kept us until now. The word cousin landed strangely between them, tangled with everything else that had grown quietly in the days since her arrival, feelings neither of them had named aloud but which had settled into every careful glance and every stolen hour spent searching for the truth together. Margaret did not know what to say, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the letters scattered across the desk between them, the fire burning low in the grate. We must be certain, she finally managed. Letters alone, however convincing, are not proof a court or a family would accept without challenge. If what you suspect is true, it changes the succession of this entire estate, does it not? If your uncle married in secret and left behind a legitimate child, that child's claim might stand above your own inheritance. Julian's expression did not waver, though Margaret watched something complicated move behind his eyes. Then we will find proof strong enough to withstand any challenge. I would rather know the truth and lose everything I was raised to expect than live another day protecting a lie my father was too ashamed to correct. That evening, after Mrs. Whitfield had retired for the night, Margaret remained in the study with Julian. Both of them too unsettled to think of sleep. She asked him, carefully, what he remembered of his uncle, though he had already told her he had never known the man. Only what my father told me, and even that was sparse, Julian admitted. He described Edmund as restless, clever, always chafing against the expectations placed on a second son. My father said Edmund resented living in another man's shadow, resented knowing that whatever he built for himself would always belong, eventually, to an older brother, who had done nothing to earn it beyond being born first. I used to think that resentment was simply youthful impatience. Now I wonder whether it was something closer to heartbreak, watching the woman he loved treated as unworthy of his name simply because his own family had not yet given him permission to claim her. Do you think your father knew about the marriage while Edmund was alive? Julian was quiet for a long moment. I believe he must have suspected something. Brothers rarely keep such matters entirely hidden from one another, whatever the world outside believes. But suspecting is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as acting. I think my father chose, for years, not to look too closely at whatever truth lay beneath the silence, because looking closely would have required him to do something about it. Margaret considered this, turning her teacup slowly in her hands, though it had long since gone cold. And when your uncle died, do you know how it happened? A fall from a horse, according to the family. I have never had reason to question it before tonight. He met her eyes, and she saw the same uneasy thought forming behind them that had already taken root in her own mind. But given everything else we have uncovered this week, I find myself no longer trusting a single detail I was raised to accept without question. They sat with that unsettling possibility between them until the candle burned low, neither willing to speak the darker suspicion aloud, though it hung in the room regardless, heavy and unspoken. Over the days that followed, their search grew more urgent. Mr. Pratt returned from London with records from the parish where Eleanor's letters suggested the secret marriage might have taken place, a small village chapel 2 counties away. Its registers kept by a clergyman long since retired but still living, according to Mr. Pratt's careful inquiries, in a cottage not far from where he had once served. Julian insisted on traveling to speak with the old clergyman himself, and against every rule of propriety, he insisted Margaret accompany him. The journey took the better part of a day, the carriage rattling over country roads while Margaret watched the unfamiliar countryside pass and tried to steady the storm of feeling building inside her. She was traveling toward the possible confirmation of everything she had ever wondered about her own birth, seated across from a man whose closeness had become, in the space of little more than a week, something she could no longer pretend was simply professional necessity. "You are quiet," Julian observed, watching her from across the carriage. "I am trying to prepare myself for whatever we find, or for finding nothing at all, and having to accept that some questions may never be answered." "Whatever we find," he said gently, "it will not change what I have already come to believe about you, Margaret. Blood or no blood, cousin or no cousin, I know the sort of woman you are. Careful, honest, braver than you give yourself credit for. That much has never required proof." She met his eyes across the small space of the carriage, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile and new, the kind of understanding that neither of them was yet prepared to give a name. The village where Reverend Fenn now lived was smaller than Margaret had expected, a scattering of stone cottages clustered around a modest chapel with a crooked spire, the whole of it wrapped in the quiet green stillness of late summer. Children played near a low stone wall as the carriage rolled past, and for a moment Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different life entirely, one where none of this searching had ever been necessary, where she had simply grown up in a village much like this one, never once wondering who her mother had been, or why her father had guarded his silence so fiercely. Julian seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts, for he reached across the carriage and covered her hand briefly with his own, a small gesture, quickly withdrawn, but one that steadied her more than any words could have. "Whatever we find today," he said quietly, "you are not walking into it alone." The old clergyman, a stooped and gentle man named Reverend Aldous Fenn, received them warmly once Julian explained the nature of their visit, though his expression grew grave as he listened to the details Julian carefully laid out. He disappeared for a long while into a back room of his small cottage, returning eventually with a heavy, leather-bound register, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "I remember the year you speak of," he said slowly, turning the fragile pages with careful hands. "It was not a common thing, in those days, for a gentleman to request a private ceremony so far from his own parish, with only myself and 2 witnesses present. I performed it because I was young then, and perhaps too willing to trust a man who paid well and asked few questions be raised. I have wondered, in the years since, whether I did right or wrong by that young woman." He found the page at last, and turned the register toward them, his finger resting on a faded entry near the bottom. 2 names, joined in marriage on an autumn day 31 years past, Eleanor Vane, spinster of this parish, and beside her name, the second name Margaret had feared and hoped in equal measure to find, Edmund Hartford, bachelor, brother to the Duke of Ravenswood. Margaret stared at the entry until the ink blurred before her eyes, aware of Julian going utterly still beside her, aware of Reverend Fenn watching them both with quiet, careful sympathy, as though he understood exactly what weight this small faded page was about to place upon both their futures. Julian let out a long, unsteady breath, staring at the faded ink, as though he could will it to rearrange itself into something less complicated. "My uncle married her. He gave her his name, whatever the family later chose to pretend. That alone changes everything I understood about my own inheritance, Reverend, though I confess I do not yet know what to do with that knowledge." "There is one more thing," the old clergyman said gently, before they could fully absorb what they had found. "I officiated a second ceremony that same year, a private christening, held quietly in this very cottage rather than the church itself. At the request of the same gentleman who married Eleanor Vane, I baptized the child myself, though I was sworn never to speak of it in the parish itself, for the family's sake." "The child's name," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember it?" Reverend Fenn turned another page, his finger tracing down a shorter, simpler entry near the bottom of the register. "Margaret Eleanor Hartford, daughter of Edmund and Eleanor Hartford, baptized in the presence of 2 witnesses, on the 14th day of October." Margaret read her own name, joined to a father she had never known existed until this very hour, and felt the careful, ordinary life she had always believed was hers dissolve completely into something far stranger, far larger, and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined it could become. Reverend Fenn watched her carefully as the weight of it settled over her, and after a moment he spoke again, his voice gentler now, as though he understood that the woman before him needed more than facts alone. I have thought of that christening many times over the years, Miss Ashworth, wondering what became of the small child I held that day. Eleanor wept through the entire ceremony, though I believe they were tears of relief as much as sorrow. She loved that baby fiercely, even in the short time I witnessed them together. Whatever became of her afterward, I have no doubt she wanted nothing more than for her daughter to grow up knowing she was loved, even if the world around her refused to acknowledge the circumstances of her birth. Margaret felt tears rise unexpectedly at the old man's words, a grief she had not known she was carrying for a mother she had never had the chance to know. Julian moved closer, his hand finding hers without hesitation this time, and neither of them cared that Reverend Fenn stood witness to the gesture. "Reverend," Julian said, once Margaret had composed herself enough to speak, "would you be willing to provide a written statement of what you have shown us today, along with copies of both entries in your register? I intend to see this matter settled properly, through whatever legal channels are necessary, and I suspect there are those within my own family who will not accept the truth easily." "I will do more than that," Reverend Fenn said firmly. "I will testify to it myself, before any court or council that requires it, if it means a wrong done 30 years ago might finally be set right. I am an old man, Your Grace, and I have carried the weight of my own small silence for far too long already. I will not carry it any further." The journey back to Ravenswood Hall passed mostly in silence, though it was a different silence than the one that had accompanied them on the way out, heavier with meaning now, and threaded through with something Margaret could only describe as a fragile, uncertain hope. She watched the countryside slip past in the fading light, aware of Julian's steady presence across from her, aware too that whatever waited for them back at the estate, the truth they now carried would not stay contained for long. Word of a duke's private inquiries rarely remained private, and Margaret understood, even as the carriage rolled through the gathering dusk, that not everyone in the Hartford family would welcome what they had found. News of the marriage register reached Edmund Colby before Julian had even finished drafting his letter to the family solicitor. Colby was a distant cousin, several branches removed from the direct Hartford line, but close enough in blood that he stood to inherit the title and estate should Julian die without an heir of his own. He had visited Ravenswood Hall only rarely over the years, always with the polished manners of a man who wanted something, though Julian had never before suspected him of active malice. That changed the moment Colby arrived unannounced at the estate, 3 days after the journey to Reverend Fenn's cottage, his carriage rattling up the drive with an urgency that suggested he already knew far more than he should have. "I hear congratulations are in order," Colby said coolly, once he had been shown into the study where Julian and Margaret sat reviewing the Reverend's written statement. His eyes moved over Margaret with open assessment, cataloging her plain dress, her ink-stained fingers, the careful way she held herself in a room that clearly did not yet feel like her own. "The household staff speak of little else, a steward's daughter, discovered to be a long-lost cousin, with a claim on the family that could unseat the entire line of succession. Quite the story for the servants' hall." "You have no business discussing family matters with the servants, Colby," Julian said, his voice carrying a warning edge Margaret had not heard from him before. "On the contrary, cousin, I have every business, given that my own position in this family depends rather directly on how this matter is resolved." Colby settled himself into a chair without waiting to be invited, his gaze still fixed on Margaret. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, how convenient it must feel, discovering a hidden claim to a duke's fortune only weeks after arriving to sort through his private papers. One might almost suspect the timing was arranged rather than accidental." Margaret felt her temper rise, though she kept her voice steady. "I did not seek this out, Mr. Colby. I came here for honest wages, nothing more. The discovery found me, not the other way around." "How fortunate for you that it did." Colby's smile did not reach his eyes. "Forgeries have been managed with less evidence than a conveniently rediscovered marriage register and a set of letters that surfaced only after your arrival. I intend to see this matter examined thoroughly before any court recognizes your claim, Miss Ashworth. The Hartford name and fortune are not so easily handed over on the word of a housekeeper's fading memory and an old clergyman, eager for attention in his final years." Julian rose from his desk, his composure fraying for the first time since Margaret had known him. "You will not speak to her that way in my house." "Your house, for now," Colby returned smoothly, rising as well. "Though if this claim holds, and Miss Ashworth is indeed the legitimate daughter of your late uncle, I understand there may be questions raised about the validity of your own father's inheritance, given that Edmund was the elder of the two brothers by nearly 2 years. Did you know that, Miss Ashworth? Your father, had he lived, would have held the title before Julian's own father ever did, which would make your claim, properly examined, rather larger than simply a place in this family. It could make you the rightful heir to Ravenswood itself." The words landed in the room like a struck match, and Margaret watched understanding pass over Julian's face, a truth neither of them had fully considered until Colby spoke it aloud with such calculated precision. If Edmund had been the elder brother, and if his marriage to Eleanor had been legitimate before his death, then Margaret's claim was not simply to recognition within the family. It was potentially a claim to the dukedom itself, a possibility far more dangerous than either of them had prepared for. Colby left shortly after, promising to return with his own solicitor and to see the matter examined by the College of Arms and whatever legal authority governed such disputes, his parting look at Margaret carrying a warning she did not fail to understand. After Colby's carriage disappeared down the long drive, Margaret found she could not settle back into her work. She wandered instead to the small chapel where the family's oldest records were kept, seeking some quiet in which to think through the sudden, dizzying possibility Colby had laid before her. She had come to Ravenswood Hall seeking nothing more than honest wages, and within a fortnight she had been recast first as a lost cousin, then as a possible heir, and now, apparently, as a woman who might hold a stronger claim to the dukedom than the man who had hired her. She found Mrs. Whitfield in the chapel already, arranging fresh flowers near the family's memorial plaques, and the older woman looked up with an expression of quiet sympathy the moment she saw Margaret's face. "You have heard, then," Mrs. Whitfield said gently, "about what Mr. Colby suggested. The entire household must have heard by now, given how quickly news travels in this house." Margaret sank onto a narrow wooden pew, suddenly weary. "I never wanted any of this, Mrs. Whitfield. I only wanted to understand where I came from. I did not ask to become a threat to the very family that has, however reluctantly, begun to accept me." Mrs. Whitfield set down her flowers and came to sit beside her, taking Margaret's hand in her own weathered one. "Titles and fortunes have a way of turning even good men calculating, my dear, when they believe their own position threatened. But you are not responsible for what Edmund Colby chooses to make of this. You are only responsible for the truth, and the truth, however inconvenient for some, deserves to be known. Whatever comes of it, you have already done more good by uncovering Eleanor's story than 30 years of silence ever managed." Margaret found some small comfort in the words, though the weight of Colby's warning did not fully lift. She thought of Julian downstairs, likely already drafting letters to solicitors, and considering how best to defend against whatever legal challenge Colby intended to mount, and she wondered, not for the first time, how quickly the fragile understanding growing between them might buckle under the strain of a fight neither of them had chosen but both now found themselves bound to. In the days that followed, the situation at Ravenswood Hall deteriorated quickly. Whispers spread through the household and beyond it, carried by servants who had relatives in neighboring estates, until word reached the local newspapers that the Duke of Ravenswood had uncovered a shocking family secret involving a hidden marriage, a lost heir, and a fortune that might change hands entirely. Margaret found herself the subject of curious stares whenever she ventured beyond the estate grounds, and letters began arriving addressed to her directly, some sympathetic, many others accusing her outright of scheming to steal a title that was never meant to be hers. Julian did his best to shield her from the worst of it, but he could not control the growing storm entirely, and Margaret watched him grow more strained with each passing day, torn between his loyalty to the truth they had uncovered together, and his awareness of exactly how much that truth threatened to cost him. One afternoon, returning from the village with a basket of thread she had gone to purchase for mending, Margaret found a small crowd gathered near the estate gates, drawn by rumor and curiosity, watching the house as though expecting some dramatic confirmation to appear in the windows at any moment. A young woman among them recognized her from the description already circulating and called out, half mocking, half genuinely curious, asking whether it was true she meant to steal a dukedom from a man who had only ever shown her kindness. Margaret kept walking, her chin lifted, refusing to let the words land as deeply as they threatened to, though her hands shook faintly around the handle of her basket until she was safely back inside the gates. Edwin, the young footman, found her in the corridor moments later and, seeing her pale face, quietly offered to fetch her a cup of tea before she had even asked. "Pay them no mind, miss," he said earnestly. "Below stairs, most of us know the truth of it, whatever the village gossips choose to believe. You have done nothing but seek out what was hidden from you your whole life. That is no crime, whatever Mr. Colby wishes people to think." His small kindness steadied her more than she expected, a reminder that not everyone had turned suspicious in the face of Colby's carefully planted doubts. Still, she understood that kindness among the household staff would do little to sway a court of law, or the College of Arms, or whatever formal body would eventually be asked to weigh the evidence and decide, with cold legal precision, whether her claim to the Hartford name held any real weight at all. "I did not ask for any of this," Margaret told him one evening, finding him alone in the study long after the household had retired. "I did not come here seeking a title or a fortune, Julian. I came here needing honest work, nothing more." "I know that," he said quietly, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. "But knowing it does not make the consequences any less real, for either of us. If Colby succeeds in casting doubt on the marriage, on the register, on Reverend Fenn's testimony, you may lose everything all over again, only this time in front of the entire county, rather than in quiet obscurity. And if he fails and your claim holds, I may lose the only life I have ever known, the title my father raised me to carry, the estate I have spent my whole life learning to steward responsibly. Would that truly be such a loss?" Margaret asked softly. "You have said yourself that this inheritance was built on a lie your father chose to protect. Perhaps losing it would simply mean losing something that was never rightfully yours to begin with." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her across the candlelit study with an expression she had come to recognize over their weeks of searching together, something steady and searching, and entirely too honest for either of their comfort. "I find, strangely, that I care less about the title than I expected to, now that it stands to be lost. What troubles me far more is the thought of losing you, Margaret, once this is settled, whatever the outcome. I had not expected, when you first opened that drawer, to find myself caring for the woman on the other side of this mystery quite as much as I have come to." Margaret's breath caught, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that momentarily eclipsed every fear Colby's visit had planted. "Julian, I know it is neither the time nor the circumstance for such a confession," he continued before she could finish, "with Colby threatening scandal, and the entire county watching to see how this resolves. But I find I can no longer pretend otherwise, not to you, and not to myself. Whatever the courts decide about titles and inheritances, I know what I have come to feel in these past weeks is entirely real, and entirely mine to claim, regardless of what name either of us carries by the end of it." She crossed the small space between them before she had fully decided to move, and he met her halfway, his hand rising to cup her face with a gentleness that steadied every fear still churning inside her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the study silent around them but for the crackle of the dying fire, and when he finally lowered his head toward hers, Margaret did not pull away. The kiss was brief, careful, both of them acutely aware of everything still unresolved between them, but it settled something in Margaret that had been unsteady since the moment she first found her own face staring back at her from a locked drawer. Whatever Colby threatened, whatever the courts eventually decided, she understood now that she was no longer facing any of it alone. "We will need more than Reverend Fenn's testimony to withstand a proper legal challenge," Julian said eventually, though he did not step back from her, his hand still resting warm against her cheek. "Colby will bring every resource he has to discredit this claim. We must be prepared to meet him with more than letters and a clergyman's memory." "Then we had better find it," Margaret said, steadying herself against the warmth of his nearness, "before he finds a way to bury the truth all over again." Julian nodded, though the worry had not fully left his eyes. "There is one place we have not yet searched. My grandmother kept a private diary, I am told, locked away somewhere in the old nursery wing after her death. If anyone in this family recorded the full truth of what happened to Eleanor, it would have been her. She never forgave my grandfather for what was done, or so my father once told me, though he refused to explain further." Margaret felt a fresh current of determination steady her nerves. "Then that is where we begin tomorrow. Colby may have solicitors and rumor on his side, Julian, but we have the truth, and I do not intend to let him bury it a second time." The old nursery wing had not been opened in years, and the door groaned in protest when Julian finally forced it wide the next morning, dust rising into the pale light filtering through shuttered windows. Margaret followed him inside, past covered furniture and forgotten toys left exactly as they had been decades before, until they reached a small writing desk tucked into the corner beneath a faded portrait of a stern-faced woman Margaret assumed must be Julian's grandmother. It took the better part of an hour searching through drawers stiff with disuse before Julian found what he was looking for, a slim, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a false bottom in the desk's lowest drawer, clearly hidden with deliberate care. He handed it to Margaret without a word, his expression tight with anticipation, and together they sat on the dust-sheeted floor and began to read. The old Duchess had written in a small, precise hand, and her entries from the year of Eleanor's disappearance left little room for doubt. She had known of the secret marriage from the beginning, had in fact witnessed it herself, standing as one of the two required witnesses alongside a servant long since passed away. She had watched her younger son marry the governess in secret, watched the pregnancy that followed, and watched her husband, the old Duke, discover the truth only after Edmund's sudden death. He forbade any acknowledgement of the marriage, the Duchess had written, furious that Edmund's careless choice, as he called it, might complicate the succession should anything befall our elder son. He said the governess would be paid to disappear quietly, and the child, if it survived, would be given away to be raised elsewhere, far from any claim on this family. I begged him to reconsider. I was overruled, as I always was in matters concerning this family's name. Margaret read on, her chest tightening with each new entry, learning that the old Duchess had secretly arranged for extra funds to be sent to the steward's family who agreed to raise the infant girl. A small mercy she had managed against her husband's wishes, though never enough, in her own words, to atone for the cruelty of separating a mother from her newborn child. The final entries grew increasingly bitter, the Duchess recording her husband's declining health with something close to grim satisfaction, and her own private hope that one day, long after both she and her husband were gone, the truth might finally surface and set right what had been so deliberately wronged. She wanted this found, Margaret said softly, closing the diary with careful hands. She hid it where someone would eventually look, rather than destroying it entirely. She wanted the truth to survive her. Julian nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of grief and quiet resolve. This, alongside Reverend Fenn's register and Eleanor's letters, should be more than sufficient to withstand any challenge Colby intends to bring. My grandmother's own testimony, written in her private hand years before either of us existed to benefit from it, cannot easily be dismissed as forgery or convenient invention. Before the formal hearing could be arranged, word reached Ravenswood Hall that Colby had not been idle in the days since his first visit. He had traveled to the village near Reverend Fenn's cottage himself, attempting to persuade the old clergyman's neighbors that the register had been tampered with, and when that failed, he had turned his attention toward discrediting Mrs. Whitfield instead, spreading quiet suggestions among the local gentry that a housekeeper desperate to protect her own long-buried involvement in Eleanor's disappearance might have every reason to fabricate a convenient story now, 30 years too late for anyone to easily disprove. Mrs. Whitfield bore the rumors with more composure than Margaret expected, though it clearly cost her a great deal. I have weathered worse than idle gossip in my years here, she told Margaret one evening, though her hands trembled slightly as she said it. But I confess I did not expect, after finally finding the courage to speak the truth, that speaking it would paint a target upon my own back as well as yours. Julian, upon learning of Colby's tactics, rode into the village himself the following morning, determined to see that neither Reverend Fenn nor Mrs. Whitfield suffered further for their honesty. He returned by evening with assurances that the local magistrate, a longtime family acquaintance, had agreed to formally record both their testimonies under oath well before the hearing itself, closing off any opportunity for Colby to claim the accounts had been altered or coached under pressure. He is growing desperate, Julian observed, pacing the study that night, while Margaret watched from her chair near the fire. A desperate man makes careless mistakes, but he can also make dangerous ones. I do not trust that he has exhausted every tactic available to him yet. His caution proved warranted only 2 days later, when Margaret received an anonymous letter, slipped beneath her bedroom door sometime in the night, warning her in blunt, unsigned terms to abandon her claim and leave Ravenswood Hall quietly, or risk having certain unflattering falsehoods about her character circulated widely enough to ruin any prospects she might otherwise have, regardless of how the hearing eventually concluded. Margaret brought the letter to Julian immediately, her hands unsteady despite her effort to remain composed. Julian's expression turned to something colder than Margaret had yet seen from him as he read the threat. This bears examining by the magistrate as well. Whatever else Colby is willing to risk in open argument, threatening a woman anonymously in the dead of night is an entirely different matter, and one I do not intend to let pass unanswered. The magistrate, upon reviewing the letter alongside samples of Colby's known handwriting obtained discreetly from old estate correspondence, confirmed what both Margaret and Julian had already suspected. The threat had come from Colby's own hand, disguised only poorly in his haste. Confronted with the evidence privately before the hearing could even begin, Colby blustered and denied everything at first, but the magistrate's quiet, unyielding manner eventually wore through his bravado, and he was warned in no uncertain terms that any further attempt to intimidate witnesses or claimants would result in charges being brought against him directly, regardless of his family connections. Colby arrived at the formal hearing several days later visibly chastened, though no less determined to fight the claim through legitimate means, and it was in this considerably more cautious frame of mind, that he brought his solicitor to challenge the evidence Margaret and Julian had gathered. They carried the diary back to the study together, and within days Mr. Pratt had arranged for the matter to be formally examined, first by a panel of legal experts familiar with matters of inheritance and succession, and eventually, given the scale of the estate involved, by representatives of the College of Arms itself. Colby, true to his earlier threat, arrived with his own solicitor in tow, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Grimsby who wasted no time attempting to poke holes in every piece of evidence Margaret and Julian presented. The formal hearing took place in the Great Hall of Ravenswood itself, transformed for the occasion into something resembling a courtroom, with witnesses called and evidence laid out across a long table for the panel's careful examination. Margaret sat beside Julian throughout, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching Mr. Grimsby circle each piece of proof like a hawk searching for the smallest weakness to exploit. "The register from this so-called Reverend Fenn," Grimsby began, "is conveniently produced only after Miss Ashworth's arrival at Ravenswood Hall, by a man of advanced age whose memory, however well-intentioned, cannot be considered infallible after 30 years. Reverend Fenn, called to testify in person despite his frail health, answered with a steadiness that impressed even the sternest members of the panel. My memory of that autumn has never faded, sir, precisely because the circumstances were so unusual. I have performed hundreds of ordinary ceremonies in my years of service. I have performed exactly one secret marriage between a duke's younger son and a governess forced to hide her condition from the world. Such an event does not blur with time, whatever else an old man may forget." Mrs. Whitfield, called next to testify, spoke plainly of the night she had watched Eleanor carried away in a weeping heap, and of the years of silence she had kept afterward out of fear rather than complicity. Grimsby attempted to suggest her account had grown embellished with time, shaped by sympathy for Margaret rather than accurate memory, but Mrs. Whitfield met his questioning with a steadiness that seemed to surprise even herself. "I have kept this house for 30 years, sir, through 3 different masters and more scandals than I care to count. My memory of ordinary matters may indeed grow hazy with age. My memory of watching a young woman I loved dearly torn from the only home she had ever known does not fade, and I resent the suggestion that grief has somehow corrupted it." Grimsby moved next to challenge Eleanor's letters, suggesting they might have been forged or altered to support a fraudulent claim, but a handwriting expert brought in by Mr. Pratt confirmed the ink and paper were consistent with the period claimed, and that the handwriting matched other confirmed samples of Eleanor's writing, preserved in the household's old employment records. Colby's expression darkened with each piece of evidence that survived scrutiny, his careful composure fraying as the hearing wore into its second day. It was the old Duchess's diary that ultimately proved decisive. The panel members read through her entries in careful silence, and Margaret watched their expressions shift from cautious skepticism to something closer to somber conviction as they absorbed the Duchess's own words, written in her private hand with no possible motive for fabrication, confirming every detail Margaret and Julian had painstakingly assembled. "This is preposterous," Colby finally burst out, rising from his seat as the panel conferred quietly among themselves. "A dead woman's diary, conveniently favorable to Miss Ashworth's claim, discovered only after she and my cousin developed what I understand has become a rather close personal understanding. I would ask this panel to consider whether such closeness has clouded the Duke's judgment regarding the authenticity of evidence that so conveniently benefits the woman he has grown attached to." The accusation landed like a slap, and Margaret felt heat rise to her face, aware of every eye in the great hall turning toward her and Julian. Julian rose slowly to his feet, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the room completely. "You may question the evidence, Colby, as is your right, and this panel has examined it thoroughly and found it sound. But you will not question Miss Ashworth's character, nor imply that either of us has acted with anything less than complete honesty throughout this inquiry. I sought this truth not knowing where it would lead, nor what it might cost me personally. I have found, in the course of that search, a woman I have come to deeply respect and care for. That fact does not diminish the truth of what we have uncovered. If anything, it should tell you how thoroughly that truth has withstood my own scrutiny, given how much easier it would have been for me to simply bury it, as my father once did, rather than risk everything I was raised to inherit." A ripple of quiet approval moved through the gathered onlookers at Julian's words, and Margaret saw several members of the panel exchange glances that suggested his defense had done his cause no harm, whatever formal weight such impressions carried in matters of evidence. Grimsby attempted one final challenge, questioning why no legal claim had ever been raised on Margaret's behalf during the many years between her birth and this sudden discovery, suggesting that true legitimate heirs did not typically remain hidden for 3 decades without anyone pressing their case. Mr. Pratt rose to answer this himself, his usual caution replaced by something firmer. The steward who raised Miss Hartford as his own daughter was, by every account gathered in this inquiry, a man paid to keep his silence and threatened, however quietly, with consequences should he ever break it. A frightened man protecting the only child he had left in the world after losing his wife cannot fairly be faulted for choosing caution over confrontation with a duke's household. The absence of an earlier claim speaks to the effectiveness of the silence imposed upon this family 30 years ago, not to any weakness in the claim itself. The hall fell silent at his words, and even Grimsby seemed to have no ready response. The panel withdrew shortly after to deliberate privately, leaving Margaret and Julian to wait through an agonizing stretch of hours in a small antechamber off the great hall, neither of them speaking much, both too aware of how much rested on the coming decision. "Whatever they decide," Julian said finally, breaking the long silence, "I meant what I said out there. None of this has changed how I feel about you, Margaret. If anything, watching you face Colby's attacks with such steady grace these past days has only deepened it." Margaret reached for his hand, grateful beyond words for the steadiness of his presence beside her. "Whatever they decide, Julian, I have already found what I came here searching for. I know now where I came from, who my mother was, who loved me before I ever had the chance to know her. That truth belongs to me regardless of what any panel decides about titles or inheritances." When the panel finally returned, their expressions were grave but not unkind, and the eldest among them, a silver-haired official from the College of Arms, addressed the assembled hall with careful, measured words. Having examined all evidence presented, including the sworn testimony of Reverend Aldous Fenn, the correspondence of Eleanor Vane Hartford, and the private diary of the late Duchess of Ravenswood, this panel finds sufficient and credible proof that a legitimate marriage took place between Edmund Hartford and Eleanor Vane, and that Margaret Eleanor Hartford, known during her upbringing as Margaret Ashworth, is the legitimate surviving child of that union. A murmur swept through the hall, and Margaret felt Julian's hand tighten around hers, though the official was not yet finished speaking. "However," he continued, "this panel further finds that Edmund Hartford predeceased his own father, the late Duke, and therefore never himself held the title of Duke of Ravenswood. Under the established rules of succession, the title and estate passed correctly to Edmund's younger brother upon their father's death, and subsequently to the current Duke, Julian Hartford, upon his own father's passing. Miss Hartford's legitimacy is confirmed, and with it her rightful place within this family, but the current Duke's title and inheritance remain entirely secure and unchallenged under the law." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash through her, tangled with something more complicated, grief for the mother she would never know, gratitude for a truth finally spoken aloud after 30 years of careful silence, and a fierce, unexpected joy at hearing herself named, publicly and legally, as Margaret Hartford, daughter of Edmund and Eleanor, cousin to the Duke of Ravenswood himself. Colby left the hall without a word to anyone, his defeat written plainly across his face, and Margaret understood, watching him go, that whatever resentment he carried would likely follow him for a long while yet. But she found she could not spare much concern for him in that moment, not with Julian turning to her, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer seemed inclined to hide from the crowd still gathered around them. "Cousin," he said softly, though the word carried none of the distance it might have carried weeks before, only warmth, and something that promised far more than mere family loyalty. "Julian," she answered, and found she could not stop the smile breaking across her own face, despite the exhaustion of the long hearing and the weight of everything finally settled. In the weeks following the hearing, Ravenswood Hall settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm, one Margaret was still learning to trust. She was no longer simply an employee hired to catalog old ledgers, nor a suspicious stranger whose face unsettled the household staff. She was Margaret Hartford now, cousin to the Duke, a woman with a confirmed place in a family she had spent her entire life not knowing existed. Mrs. Whitfield insisted on moving her belongings from the small servants' room at the end of the corridor to a proper guest chamber in the family wing, and though Margaret protested the change felt unnecessary, she found herself, in quiet moments alone by the window of her new room, grateful for a comfort she had never expected to receive. Julian gave her space in those first weeks, careful not to press the tender, unresolved feeling that had grown between them during the chaos of the hearing, though Margaret often caught him watching her across the dinner table with an expression that suggested his patience was more a matter of respect than indifference. She appreciated it more than she could easily express. She had spent her entire life being defined by absence, an unknown mother, a father who guarded his silence until his death, and now, suddenly, a family history so large and complicated, it had required a formal legal hearing simply to confirm her own name. She needed time to understand who she was within all of it before she could fully give herself to anything else, however much her heart already leaned in that direction. She spent much of those quiet weeks finishing the work she had originally been hired to do, cataloging the estate's papers with a thoroughness that felt, now, like an act of love rather than mere employment. Among the boxes she had not yet reached, tucked into a corner of the old study, she found a small trunk belonging to Eleanor herself, apparently recovered from the cottage where she had once been sent to live out her final months before whatever fate ultimately claimed her. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue long since yellowed with age, Margaret found a christening gown, delicately embroidered, clearly meant for an infant, alongside a small lock of pale hair tied with faded ribbon and a single miniature portrait, smaller than the one Margaret had first found in the Duke's desk drawer, showing Eleanor herself, young and smiling, her arms wrapped around a baby whose face was unmistakably, achingly, the same face Margaret saw each morning in her own mirror. She sat with that portrait for a long while, tears falling freely in the quiet of the empty study, grieving a mother she had never had the chance to know, yet feeling, for the first time in her life, entirely certain of where she had come from, and how deeply she had once been loved, even in circumstances that had denied that love any public acknowledgement. Julian found her there eventually, and rather than intruding on her grief, he simply sat beside her in silence, letting her lean into his shoulder, until the tears finally eased. "She would be proud of you," he said quietly, once Margaret had composed herself enough to speak. Whatever fear shaped her final months, however this family failed her, she raised a daughter, even from a distance, who grew into a woman of remarkable courage. I do not think that courage came from nowhere, Margaret. I think it came directly from her. One afternoon, while sorting through the last of the unexamined boxes in the study, Margaret came across a bundle of correspondence addressed to her own father, written in an unfamiliar hand and dated from the years shortly after she had been placed in his care. She recognized, with a start, the seal pressed into the wax as belonging to the old Duchess herself, and opened the letters with trembling hands, aware she was about to read words meant for her father's eyes alone, written by the grandmother she had never known existed, until Julian uncovered her diary. The letters were brief, practical, concerned mostly with the quiet arrangement of funds meant to support Margaret's upbringing without ever revealing their true source. But threaded through the careful, businesslike language, Margaret found small, unmistakable notes of tenderness, questions after the child's health, gentle inquiries about whether she had begun to walk, to speak her first words, whether she showed any resemblance yet to the mother she would never know. The Duchess had asked, in nearly every letter, for a small portrait or sketch of the growing girl, though Margaret's father, cautious to the end, appeared never to have sent one, fearing perhaps that even so small a connection might unravel the careful anonymity meant to protect his daughter. The final letter in the bundle, dated only months before the old Duchess's own death, carried a different tone entirely, softer, almost pleading. "I know I have asked you for little beyond assurances of her well-being," the Duchess had written, "and I understand your caution, given all this family has done to earn your distrust. But I find myself in these final months wishing only that I might see her face once, even from a distance, before I am no longer able. I do not ask this as a duchess making a demand of a steward. I ask it as a grandmother who has spent every day since her birth carrying the weight of a silence I was too weak to break while my husband lived." There was no record of whether her father had granted this final wish, and Margaret found herself wondering, with fresh grief, whether the old woman had died never having seen the granddaughter she had quietly protected from afar for so many years. She brought the letters to Julian that evening, and together they searched what remained of the old Duchess's private effects, eventually finding, tucked into the back of an old prayer book, a small folded sketch of a child perhaps 3 or 4 years old, unmistakably Margaret, though she had no memory of ever sitting for such a drawing. "Your father must have relented, in the end," Julian said softly, studying the small, careful pencil lines. "Perhaps only once, perhaps in secret, but he gave her this much comfort before she died." Margaret held the sketch carefully, feeling as though she were holding a small piece of a story that had, until now, seemed entirely one of loss and silence, and finding within it, unexpectedly, a thread of quiet love that had persisted despite every effort to sever it. "I wish I could have known her," she said. "Both of them, my mother and my grandmother, each carrying their own private grief for a connection this family refused to let them have openly." "You know them now," Julian said gently, "as much as anyone still can. Through their letters, their diaries, the small mercies they managed to extend even from a distance. That is not nothing, Margaret. That is, perhaps, the only kind of knowing left available to us where the dead are concerned, and I think it is enough to honor them properly. It was Reverend Fenn, in the end, who finally provided the last piece of the story neither Margaret nor Julian had thought to seek. He wrote to them some weeks after the hearing concluded, explaining that in searching through his own old parish records for anything further of use, he had discovered a burial entry from a village nearly 40 miles from Ravenswood, dated less than a year after Eleanor's disappearance, for a woman whose description matched hers closely, listed only as a stranger to the parish, who had died of a fever while lodging at a local inn. There was no certainty in it, the Reverend cautioned, but it offered, for the first time, a possible answer to the question of what had ultimately become of Eleanor after she vanished from the only life she had known. Margaret and Julian traveled together to the small village to see the grave for themselves, a modest stone marker in a quiet churchyard, worn nearly smooth by decades of rain, bearing only the words "a stranger" and a date that matched the timeline of Eleanor's disappearance with painful precision. Margaret knelt beside it for a long while, laying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered along the roadside, finally able to grieve a mother whose fate had remained an unanswered question for the whole of her life. She died alone, Margaret said softly, far from everyone who might have loved her, without even her own name marking where she rested. Julian knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. Then let us give her that now. I will see to it personally that a proper stone is placed here, bearing her true name, and if you wish it, we might arrange for her remains to be moved to the family plot at Ravenswood, where she should have been laid to rest 30 years ago, had this family shown her the honesty she deserved while she still lived. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and Julian simply held her hand until she was ready to rise and return to the carriage waiting beyond the churchyard gate. With Eleanor's grave now confirmed, Julian arranged, with Margaret's blessing, to have her remains carefully and respectfully moved to the family plot at Ravenswood, laid to rest at last beside the husband she had married in secret and been denied in death. The small ceremony marking the occasion was quiet, attended only by Margaret, Julian, Mrs. Whitfield, and Reverend Fenn, who insisted on making the long journey once more despite his failing health, declaring that he owed Eleanor at least this final act of honesty after keeping her secret for so many years, out of duty to men who had never deserved his loyalty. Standing beside the new grave, its stone finally bearing Eleanor's true name alongside the dates of her short life, Margaret felt something settle within her that she had been carrying, unnamed, since the very first day she had opened that drawer in Julian's study. It was not simply relief, though relief was certainly part of it. It was closure, hard-won and long overdue, the final closing of a story that had been left painfully unfinished for 30 years by people too afraid or too proud to face its consequences. "Thank you," she told Julian afterward, as they walked together back toward the house through the quiet autumn gardens, "for not simply protecting your own inheritance when you might easily have justified doing so. For choosing the truth, even when it threatened everything you had been raised to expect." "I could not have chosen otherwise," Julian said simply. "Not once I understood what silence had already cost this family, and what it continued to cost you. I would rather share Ravenswood with a cousin who deserves her place in it than rule alone over an inheritance built on a lie I knew to be false. That was never truly a choice at all, Margaret, not once I came to know you as more than simply the woman who found a portrait in my desk drawer." In the months that followed, Ravenswood Hall changed in quiet, meaningful ways. A new portrait of Eleanor, copied faithfully from the small miniature Margaret had found in the old trunk, was commissioned and hung once more in the East Gallery, filling the gap that had stood empty for 30 years. Mrs. Whitfield oversaw the placement herself, standing before it with tears in her eyes, finally able to look upon the face of the woman she had loved and lost, without having to pretend she had never existed at all. The household staff, once uneasy around Margaret, grew warm and familiar with her over time, understanding at last why her face had so unsettled them on her very first day, and coming to see in her not a stranger but a piece of the family's history finally restored to its rightful place. Colby, for his part, did not return to Ravenswood Hall again, though Margaret heard, through occasional correspondence between Julian and other distant relations, that he had eventually settled into a quieter, more modest life, his ambitions for the dukedom permanently extinguished by the hearing's outcome. Margaret found she carried no lingering bitterness toward him. Whatever cruelty he had shown in trying to protect his own position, she understood now, better than most, how deeply the fear of losing one's place in the world could distort a person's choices. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly a year after Margaret had first opened that fateful drawer in the Duke's study, that that Julian finally spoke the words Margaret had sensed building in him for months. They stood together in the East Gallery, before Eleanor's newly hung portrait, the last light of the day slanting golden through the tall windows. "I have loved you, I think, since the night you stood in my study demanding I tell you the truth about a portrait I had spent years trying to forget," Julian said, turning to face her fully. "I did not expect, when you first arrived at Ravenswood Hall, that hiring a steward's daughter to organize my family's papers would lead me to the one person who could finally help me set right a wrong 3 decades old. I did not expect, either, that in helping me find your own history, you would become so entirely essential to my future." Margaret felt her heart swell with a warmth that had been building steadily since that first strange, unsettling day, now grown into something she no longer had any wish to guard against. "I came here searching for nothing more than honest wages, Julian, and instead, I found my mother's story," my father's silence explained, "and a family I never knew I belonged to. I did not expect, in the midst of all that searching, to fall in love with the very man whose secrets I had come here to uncover." Julian knelt then, before the portrait of the mother who had given Margaret her courage, and asked the question Margaret had, in her own quiet heart, already answered many times over in the months since their search together began. She said yes without hesitation, her voice steady and sure, and when he rose to take her in his arms, the last of the autumn light fell warm across them both, as though even the old house itself had been waiting, through 30 long years of silence, for this particular ending to finally arrive. They were married the following spring, in the same small village chapel where Eleanor and Edmund had once exchanged their own secret vows, though this time the ceremony was neither hidden nor hurried, but celebrated openly before family, friends, and household staff who had, by then, come to love Margaret as thoroughly as they had once loved the mother she so closely resembled. Reverend Fenn, though frail, insisted on officiating himself, declaring it the greatest honor of his long career to finally see a story he had helped uncover reach so joyful a conclusion. Margaret stood at the altar in a gown of pale gold, Eleanor's small locket of hair pinned discreetly at her collar, and as she looked into Julian's eyes and spoke her vows, she understood that she had not simply found a title, or a fortune, or even a husband, in the strange unfolding of the past year. She had found herself, fully and completely, in a house that had once tried to erase her mother's name entirely, and had instead become, through patience and courage, and the stubborn persistence of truth, the very place where she finally belonged. Mrs. Whitfield wept openly through the entire ceremony, seated in the front pew beside Reverend Fenn, and afterward, as the wedding party made its way back toward Ravenswood Hall for the celebration awaiting them, she caught Margaret's hand for a brief, quiet moment. "Eleanor would have been so proud of the woman you became, my dear, and so grateful, I think, to see you standing where she herself was once denied the chance to stand. You have given her, in the end, the ending she always deserved, even if it came 30 years later than it should have." Margaret embraced her warmly, feeling the full weight of everything they had uncovered together settle at last into something steady and whole. As the carriages rolled up the long familiar drive toward the house that had once felt like a stranger's home and now, entirely, felt like her own, she looked back once more toward the quiet churchyard behind them, and silently thanked the mother she had never known for the courage that had, against every obstacle placed before it, finally found its way home. 2 years after her wedding, Margaret stood once more in the study where her strange, unraveling story had first begun, though the room looked entirely different now from the neglected archive she had been hired to organize. Sunlight streamed freely through windows no longer shuttered against the past, and the desk where she had once found a hidden portrait now held, among its neat stacks of correspondence, a small framed sketch of her own daughter, born the previous spring and named Eleanor, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose courage had shaped every part of the life now waiting for her. Julian found Margaret there often, in quiet mornings before the household fully woke, tending to correspondence or simply sitting with the weight of how far they had come since that first startling day. He entered now carrying their daughter against his shoulder, the infant fussing softly, before settling at the familiar sound of her mother's voice. "She has your look already," Margaret said, taking the baby into her own arms, studying the small face with a tenderness that still occasionally caught her by surprise. "Your eyes, at least. Everything else, I think, belongs entirely to the Hartford side." "I rather think she has your stubbornness," Julian said, settling into the chair across from her, "given how thoroughly she refused to sleep through the night for her first 3 months among us." Margaret laughed, a sound that came easily now, in ways it rarely had during those tense early weeks of uncovering the truth about her birth. She thought often, in quiet moments like this one, of how differently her life might have unfolded had she never opened that drawer. Had Julian never entered the study at precisely the moment she held Eleanor's portrait in her hands? She did not believe in fate the way some did, but she found it difficult, looking back, to call any of it mere coincidence either. Mrs. Whitfield had stayed on at Ravenswood, now more a beloved family fixture than a housekeeper managing daily duties, though she still insisted on personally overseeing the nursery whenever little Eleanor required attention. She had grown close with Margaret in ways neither of them had expected when they first met over a rattling tea tray, bound together by grief for a woman they had both, in different ways, come to love, without ever having known her fully. It was Mrs. Whitfield who suggested, gently, that the small trunk of Eleanor's belongings found in the old study be placed in the nursery itself, so that the newest Eleanor might grow up surrounded by some quiet trace of the grandmother whose story had brought her parents together. Reverend Fenn had passed peacefully the previous winter, in his own small cottage, with Julian and Margaret at his bedside in his final days. He had asked, near the end, that Margaret read aloud from Eleanor's letters one final time, listening with his eyes closed and a small, contented smile on his weathered face, as though hearing the young governess's voice once more, carried forward through her daughter's careful reading, offered him some measure of peace before he finally let go. He was buried, at his own request, in the same small churchyard where he had once performed a secret marriage and a hidden christening decades before, not far from the grave where Eleanor herself had once lain unnamed and unclaimed. Colby's name arose only rarely in conversation at Ravenswood now, though Margaret occasionally heard word of him through distant relations who still moved in the same social circles. He had married eventually, a woman of modest fortune from a neighboring county, and settled into a quieter life than the one he had once imagined for himself as heir to a dukedom. Margaret felt, when she thought of him at all, a distant sympathy rather than lingering resentment, understanding better than most how deeply the fear of losing one's place in the world could warp even an otherwise ordinary man's choices. She hoped, without any particular need to know for certain, that he had found some measure of peace in the life that remained to him. The East Gallery, once marked by a single conspicuous gap where Eleanor's portrait had been torn down and hidden away, now held a small but growing collection dedicated to her memory. Beside her restored portrait hung a framed copy of Reverend Fenn's marriage register entry, and beneath it, in a modest glass case, the small collection of letters that had once been hidden in a locked drawer, now displayed openly for any member of the household or visiting family to read, should they wish to understand the full history of the woman who had once been erased so thoroughly from Ravenswood's story. Margaret had insisted on this openness deliberately, unwilling to let her mother's memory slip back into the kind of careful silence that had defined this family for 30 years before her own arrival. She often brought visitors to the gallery herself, recounting Eleanor's story plainly and without shame, understanding that every retelling was itself a small act of justice for a woman who had been denied the chance to tell her own story while she lived. One afternoon, a young woman arrived at Ravenswood Hall seeking employment, much as Margaret herself once had, recommended by the same London solicitor who had first sent Margaret's own letter of introduction 2 years before. Margaret received her personally in the study, recognizing something of her own younger uncertainty in the girl's careful posture and quick, nervous glances around the grand room. The young woman, whose name was Charlotte, had come seeking work as a governess for the growing household, and Margaret found herself, partway through their conversation, telling her gently that this particular house understood better than most how deeply a governess's life and reputation deserved to be protected and honored, rather than treated as something disposable. There was once a woman in this very house, Margaret told her, whose position here was treated as though it made her invisible, her feelings unworthy of consideration, her future entirely at the mercy of people who held more power than she ever could. I do not intend for any woman under this roof to be treated that way again, for as long as I have any influence over how Ravenswood conducts itself. Charlotte accepted the position gladly, and in the months that followed, Margaret made a quiet point of ensuring the young governess was treated with the same respect and consideration extended to any other member of the household, understanding it as a small, ongoing act of restitution for a wrong that could never be fully undone, but could, at least, be prevented from repeating itself. Julian, watching his wife take on these quiet responsibilities alongside the more visible duties of managing the estate, often remarked that she had transformed Ravenswood far more thoroughly than any renovation or redecoration could have managed. It was not simply that the East Gallery now told an honest story, or that the household staff moved through their days with an openness that had been entirely absent during his father's time. It was that the very character of the house had shifted, becoming a place where truth, however uncomfortable, was no longer something to be buried in locked drawers and forgotten diaries. but something to be faced directly, however long it took, and whatever it cost. In the autumn of their second year of marriage, Margaret and Julian traveled together to the small cottage where her father had once raised her, now occupied by new tenants who knew nothing of its history. They did not disturb the current residents, content simply to stand outside the modest stone walls for a while, remembering the quiet, careful man who had raised Margaret with more love than she had ever fully appreciated until she understood the full weight of the secret he had carried on her behalf for her entire childhood. "He gave up so much to protect you," Julian said, as they stood together at the edge of the small overgrown garden where Margaret had played as a child, never once suspecting the truth of her own origins. A comfortable position, perhaps even a life of his own choosing, all so that a duke's dying wish to erase an inconvenient scandal would not touch the child he had come to love as his own daughter. Margaret walked slowly along the low garden wall, remembering small fragments of her childhood, now colored entirely differently by everything she had since learned. She recalled her father's habit of watching the road from their cottage window on quiet evenings, as though waiting for a visitor who never came, and understood now that he had likely spent years bracing himself against the possibility that the family he had fled with her might one day track them down and undo the fragile safety he had built. She recalled, too, small kindnesses she had never fully appreciated as a child, birthday gifts that seemed slightly beyond their modest means, an insistence on her learning to read and write well beyond what most stewards' daughters were taught, as though he had always quietly hoped she might one day need those skills for a life larger than the one they shared together in their small cottage. "I think in the end, he gave me something more valuable than comfort," Margaret said softly. "He gave me an ordinary childhood, free from the weight of a secret I was not yet old enough to carry. I did not learn to fear my own history until I was ready to face it fully, and I have him to thank for that, however much silence it required of him." They visited her father's grave before returning to Ravenswood, a modest headstone in the small churchyard near her childhood home, and Margaret knelt there for a long while, telling him quietly of everything that had happened since his passing, of the mother she had finally come to know through letters and diaries, of the family she had found, of the daughter now carrying his memory forward alongside Eleanor's, of the life he had made possible through years of careful, sacrificial silence. Walking back toward the waiting carriage, her hand held securely in Julian's own, Margaret felt the last remaining thread of grief settle into something gentler, something closer to gratitude than sorrow. She had spent the better part of 2 years uncovering a story built on secrets, loss, and 30 years of careful silence, but she understood now, standing in the quiet autumn light with her husband beside her and her daughter waiting for them at home, that every part of that difficult journey had led her, step by unexpected step, toward exactly the life she had always been meant to claim. As the fire settled low in the grate and Julian reached for her hand across the familiar desk, Margaret allowed herself, at last, the full and unguarded peace of knowing exactly who she was, where she had come from, and precisely where, after everything, she truly belonged.